Have you seen any starter homes for sale lately? Neither have I. Hello, and welcome to the Who Killed the Starter Home podcast. My name is Marina Rabina. I'm an architect and developer in New Jersey, working to bring starter homes back from the brink of extinction. What do you do when the equivalent of a plane full of people moves into your city every single day? These are not tourists, but people coming to stay. Calgary experienced exactly that. A successful marketing campaign attracted new residents, and suddenly growth was not theoretical, it was their reality. In this episode, I spoke with Dr. Teresa Goldstein, Chief Planner and Director of Community Planning for the City of Calgary. We discussed why flexibility is the foundation of vibrancy, how making the language of zoning understandable helps city grow gracefully, and what it looks like when government sees its role as a service provider rather than a gatekeeper. We would like to hear what you think, or if you have any ideas for how to bring the starter homes back from the brink of extinction, send us a note at starterhomepodcast@gmail.com.
I am so excited to have you on our podcast, Dr. Goldstein. And I first came across the work that Calgary is doing at a conference when I heard one of your planners present all the amazing things that are going on in Calgary. And I started researching because I'm located in New Jersey, and this was such an inspiration to me that I'm very grateful to have you here, and I hope you could share some of the unique leading things that you guys are doing. But before we get to that, if you don't mind sharing a little bit about your background, how did you become a planner?
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here, Marina. And we're the small town above Montana. The area of Calgary is kind of nestled into the Rocky Mountains to our west, and then prairies to our east. And so we have this really interesting landscape that's before us. And I moved out west in the early 2000s. I grew up in Ontario, further to the east. And I grew up in Hamilton, actually, Hamilton, Ontario, which is a steel city, really focused on manufacturing. But one of the pieces that got me into city building really early on in understanding our city was that we had a cycle where people got laid off every summer. And when the families got laid off, housing scarcity became something that was just kind of embedded in my life when I was growing up. And so when I went to university, I actually went to university to be a linguist because I love languages. And then I took a small elective in geography, and I fell in love with city planning, which led me down a whole journey of, going and getting my doctorate in 2023 after working for 25 years. But the journey of me into city planning was really from that humble beginnings in Hamilton, Ontario, and being in my position today, in working as the chief planner for a city of close to 1.7 million, with incredible growth over the last number of years. We had 150,000 people move here in the last 2 years, which is just a wild amount of growth to see in a city. And it's been incredible to lead the city through some of the challenges that go along with that. So that's where I came from, and kind of my roots, my humble roots, I call them.
I'm so intrigued that you started as a linguist, because when I try to explain city planning and zoning to people, just this morning I had a conversation with somebody. I was trying to explain it's a different language.
It is.
Isn't that so interesting?
That's the first time somebody has put those two things together for me, that my love of languages may have been a weird way, because you're right. The language of urban planning is complex, full of acronyms, full of language that it has dual meanings, or triple meanings or contextual meanings, and oftentimes is not plain language. And so that actually is a really nice connection that I had never put together.
Well, and the reason I guess I was so inspired by the information that I learned about Calgary's land use from the presentation at a conference is how connected to real world language it actually was. Because the zoning codes that I'm used to working with as an architect and a planner are usually, like you're describing, very sort of there's some abbreviation RO dash 2T, and everybody's like, what in the world is that, right? What information am I supposed to do with this? And when I learned about Calgary's zoning regulations, it was much more about things that are related to uses, related to um, how do we enter something, ground related things. So I would love for you to share how do you guys do this? How do you what it sounds like maybe we need to back up a little bit. So in Calgary, if I understand correctly, you were expecting or experiencing a large influx of people moving, right?
Correct.
Anticipated growth that needed to be accommodated.
Yeah.
Is
Yeah.
that, and then what happened?
So this is actually a really, I would say it's a case study on how successful marketing can happen at the same time as the world thinking about being more mobile. So our provincial government did this wildly successful campaign called Alberta is Calling, starting in 2018, which went across the country and into North America to entice businesses, tech companies, and head offices to continue to move out west into Western Canada, to Calgary, but also to Edmonton as well. And part of the consideration of why Calgary has been such a popular spot for growth is because we have relative affordability when it comes to our housing and to the services, our taxes, and we have excellent close recreation, all of the ingredients that you want when you're thinking about relocating. And so when I say relative affordability, what we were seeing is that not only did this campaign by our provincial government, which is the equivalent of the state government in the US, not only did that work and entice lots of businesses to move here, but there was such an interprovincial movement because other areas in Canada just continued to be increasingly unaffordable, especially to the west, which was our largest city in the west, in Western Canada, being that Vancouver metropolitan area, and then in the east around Toronto. And we saw from Ontario, which is the the province where Toronto is, we saw a massive interprovincial migration out west, and that, compounded by the campaign, meant that we were seeing, where at one point I was hearing that we were seeing 278 people moving here every day into Calgary, which was, they said something like the equivalent of a jet moving here, a 747 jet moving here every day. And what that meant was that the affordability piece that we had and we continue to have became increasingly and increasingly fragile because there were a lot of intermigration coming, quite a few international. We had a lot of international students that were coming here through our federal government had policies at the time that really encouraged post-secondary students from coming. And then getting here, the amount of housing was continuing to go down. So at the time, and this was around kind of 2021 time, our city council said things are coming to a real junction where this relative affordability that we have had is really getting pressed. And with that, they said to city administration at the time, they said, you know what, we really want to come up with a housing strategy, not just an urban planning strategy, not just a people strategy, but a housing strategy that would focus on all the different levers that the city and the sector could leverage so that we could keep that affordability. And so that really bred that the 2022 strategy, which has focused on using land use, using sector partnerships, scaling up our downtown. We had, like most North American cities, an emptying of some of our office space, a quite significant emptying. So huge opportunity there to do construction conversions, and then leveraging all the other like city levers that we have, which goes to your first question around our zoning. And so what were the pieces in our zoning that really helped this? The piece that helped this is that we knew that we had a very nimble planning set of rules through our zoning bylaw, which would allow us to use those rules to help grow the communities in ways that they hadn't seen. And that's where in 2024, our city council used zoning as the tool to help increase housing. Long story there, Marina, but it was like there was many steps along that journey.
Yeah, well, it's absolutely fascinating when the community faces such a success where, but then also trying to accommodate and welcome all these new people who have joined. So was it kind of businesses that moved first and people followed, or is it people came first and businesses that followed?
So I would say the people came first in general. We did have in that kind of 2018 time frame, we also saw some sectors growing. The tech sector has been on the continual growth in our area, but we also saw a lot of filming starting to happen in our area. So the film and production sector. Mm-hmm. And then another piece that we saw through government initiation is we saw a turn towards having Western logistics be out here as well. And so being able to create, an inland port. So where we saw businesses come to here because we are kind of central in the West to be able to set up. But the people really were coming here because we had these jobs, but we also were able to capitalize on people having very high housing costs in other places and coming here and saying, wow, we see relative affordability, which puts the pressure on our entire housing system. The other piece that's very interesting about the West, especially in Calgary, is we had a very low purpose-built rental stock. So where you would have seen programs across our country really encouraging in kind of the 2010s, 2015, encouraging developers to create rental housing. A lot of that was developed in the early 2010s as condos. And we had such a strong ownership model here that when we saw these pressures starting to come, there was an opportunity for the land developers here to capitalize on a part of our market that was really low at the time, which was that purpose-built rental. And so you saw such a spike in people coming here, businesses relocating here, and not a lot of rental housing, which could have been the perfect storm, to be honest with you. But what we saw happen is that many Calgary-based land developers, but also Canadian land developers, they really pivoted and began to see that this was a market that was completely untapped. And so we saw a huge expansion of purpose-built rental housing, joining some of the housing supply right at that time, or just a little bit after when people were really locating here.
I would love for you to spend a little bit of time and describe the actual things that you allowed or implemented, or what was the language of land use that you introduced?
So one of the conversations that administration had with our council at the time, and through a larger conversation on growth and change with Calgarians, was how do we want to welcome new people and new jobs into our city, both large scale, planning for our city for growth, but also, at the micro level. So what does housing look like on your street? And to paint the picture of Calgary, around 78% of the city of Calgary is made up of singles and semi-detached housing. It was our predominant form that was built mostly in the 1950s and 60s. Calgary was, just like many large cities in North America, was built out in a series of donuts, where our central business district or our downtown came first and then kind of moved out from there. And when we were moving out from the downtown area, which was where most of the density or the larger, multifamily housing and apartments were, what we saw was that there was a transition in a very small area that surrounds the downtown, and then it went right into being quite low density. And then many years later, in just post 2009, when we adopted our municipal development plan, what we saw tremendous growth that started to happen in our new communities that would surround the city. And so when we saw those new communities starting to come online, what we recognized there was that the density in those areas was actually much, much higher than the areas that were immediately adjacent to the downtown. So we kind of had, a series of rings around the downtown that were very low density, and then scaling up the densities again around the surrounding neighborhoods of the city. And so if you paint that picture, it also, because the more affordable housing was the areas that had higher density, what actually ended up happening from an affordability perspective is most of the areas that were surrounding the downtown became more and more expensive, and the age of the housing started to actually get to the end of their life. And so there was this opportunity for the city of Calgary to host, a series of conversations about what does the next evolution of our young city look like? Because this was the first time that we were really seeing this redevelopment happen. This is much different than in many areas, of the US that have seen like many, many cycles of redevelopment happen in their communities. This was our first time. As I said, we are a very young city here. In my academic profession, I like to say that cities grow in cycles. So for every 100 years, it's the equivalent of one human year. And so the city of Calgary would be the equivalent of 1 year old if we think about cities around the world and how old they are. And so when we saw this, there was an opportunity for us to have that conversation and to say, the families that are moving here today, while they, of course, want housing choice, they are finding that their first choice, which had historically been single detached, is no longer attainable. The income levels are not high enough. There is a finite amount, which means that the cost of the housing goes up, but also the family sizes are much smaller now. And so when in 1950s and 60s, when we had planned these neighborhoods, the average amount of Calgarians living in the home was, that 5 to 6 size family. Today, what we're seeing is 2. We're seeing the average census, that was our last census, actually was done in 2021. It was like 1.9 people per dwelling, which is very low. And if you think about the services that are dependent on family size, that can be a real challenge in those areas which at one time, had families of parents and 2 to 3 children, 3 or 4 children. And now what we're seeing is a much smaller family size, or that the families were combined. So we weren't seeing, 2 adults in a house anymore. We were seeing 1 adult with children, or we were seeing elderly parents stay in their housing longer. And so there was only 2. And so that piece in itself really allowed us the opportunity to think about what we're going to do for the next generation. And so the residential grade oriented housing forum came out of that conversation. And really what we did, which was unique, is we combined all of our housing, our low density, so our singles, our semi-detached, our duplex type of housing, and our small scale row housing, so up to 4 homes. We combine that into a single land use district or zoning code. And so every person in the city of Calgary would have the opportunity, should they desire, to redevelop their home, to be able to either take it from a single to a single, or going from a single to 2, or a single to 4. And that flexibility was one of the tools that we used in those established areas that we talked about, to be able to try and increase the density, to enable more people to live in those areas that had historically seen higher densities, but now seeing those smaller family sizes.
I'm super curious with the grade oriented. Is that what it's called? So
Yes.
walk us through that.
So what we wanted to do is we wanted to make sure that there was a lot of relevance to people, to the street. So making sure that we didn't make the density so high that we wouldn't have front porches anymore, or we wouldn't have this context between people and their sidewalks or their streets. And so grade oriented essentially means that in order to do this, you have to have a door to the street. So as many units as you have on your parcel, you have to have doors to the street. And that felt like it was the right treatment for areas that had already, many established homes that had that kind of context where it was porch and street. And in Calgary, we are on a grid system similar to lots of North American cities where we have laneways behind our homes. What it also allowed was that relevance of the porch to the front, where we would see the parking remain in the back, and we wouldn't have a series of garages along the street, but we would still keep that same type of rhythm that we were seeing in our established area. And so that grade oriented, meaning like you literally have to have it relevant to the street, became the tool that we used to enable those doors to pop up.
Yeah, I find that so kind of naturally explainable to people, right? That it creates a human and personal relationship with your neighbors to the street. And having spoken to many people and sort of the younger people, everyone is looking for that walkability and connection. And people like to have a dog and they want to walk their dog, and they want to say hi to their neighbors. And that it sounds like what your regulations are encouraging, and in fact is
Yes.
literally that you don't live somewhere where you enter a door and you go up an elevator. That's a different typology.
It is. So we, of course, have lots of apartments and multifamily types of homes, just like you mentioned. But what we wanted to really think about when we were designing this land use was we wanted to make it feel like it could be part of those older neighborhoods. And one of the important defining characteristics of many established areas is the porch and door to the street. It has this relevance to having, when you drive down a street, you have a rhythm that happens. And so by using the tools that we had, which was through the zoning, we said we want to make sure that is contextually more sensitive than, for example, going towards more of a small scale apartment, which is the single door to the street and then the internal corridors. We still do allow that in other connectors and higher order areas. But the interface between that type of housing, where it's a row house or a duplex, where there's doors to the street, was something that administration and communities felt was really important in this kind of evolution of growth and change in our city.
And so how is it working?
So, I mean, there is always challenges, and I recognize that. That's the most exciting part of working in cities and living in cities, is that they are never finished and that they evolve and live just the same like a human would. And so over the last number of years, since we've been using we call it the RCG district, or residential contextual. So the C there means that the rules were created to have contextual relevance to what is beside it. And the G means grade oriented. So what we've found is, we've had tremendous growth over the last 2 years. In fact, we just received our year-end numbers from the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, which is our federal crown corporation that manages housing across the country, that Calgary has led the way for the second year in a row in housing starts. And in saying that, I will acknowledge that there is a tremendous amount of that purpose-built rental that's being developed, which is in mostly apartment form. But over the last 2 years since we introduced that in Calgary, we've had 4,000 homes that were enabled just because we finished that rezoning application that allowed people to continue to develop right to development permits. So they didn't have to go through the zoning or the land use change at council. They could just start their permitting process to get the development going. And we've acknowledged that there have been challenges. One of the pieces that we are working on right now with our city council is making some changes to that zoning, because we've heard from communities, that they feel that there is some areas where they're too tall, and they feel that there is more work that should be done to continue to make them contextually sensitive to the neighborhood. Things like, looking at the waste and recycling. So looking at our garbage bins more closely, looking at parking standards more closely, and then also looking at the actual height of the buildings. And just like cities never, stop changing, administration, my department, we are so open to doing this work, because we know that the work that we do to improve the districts, to make them, more sensitive into the developments or into the communities, will help communities accept them into their neighborhoods even just a little bit more. Because the piece that is very difficult in growth and change is when that single home is replaced with the duplex or is replaced with that fourplex, and how we can make it more sensitive. I think is time well spent.
Wonderful. So if you could walk us through the process. So if I have a kind of a 1950s old home in one of these neighborhoods, and it's kind of coming to its end of life, and I'm interested in doing something different.
Mm-hmm.
What would be the process? What do I do?
Yeah. So
let's say I wanted to have a fourplex.
Sure. And something that is unique to the city of Calgary is we have spent an extensive amount of time over the last 10 years making sure that our internal reviews of development and how we process development is as streamlined as possible. It's been a real mantra of mine and my predecessors on how to make the review inside the city the most efficient as possible. And so one of the pieces when you make your application is that you will immediately receive notification. Everything is done online, so it's completely paperless, and you will immediately receive a notification of your application is complete and it's ready to go in. So you can't actually make an application unless it's complete, and you've satisfied all of the requirements, which has been wonderful because there's a lot of administrative time that is spent chasing down transportation studies and chasing down all of the different things. Following that application, we would have a conversation with you as an applicant to say, what is your hopes and dreams for this application? What do you want to do? How do you want to do it? What's your time frame? And by having that kind of conversation, we're able to streamline our timeline. So if you know that you have a certain timeline, our timeline right now is 40 days. We have 40 days from the time when you make an application to the time when we want to provide you with our decision on your type of application that you just made. But if you say to us, I have these other things that I have going, we can make a custom time together to make sure that it really reflects that customer service lens that the city has really been trying to, figure out the sweet spot to follow. And then following that, right now in our city, to do what you want to do, you would not need a land use amendment. So our city council back in 2024 did a rezoning that enabled up to 4 homes on every parcel in the city of Calgary. And so you would be able to just apply right away for development. And when you make that application, it's circulated, it's reviewed, you're working with the city, and then you're working with the community as well. And so we have a strong culture here to want to facilitate conversations through applications with the community, because there's nothing that could be worse than being surprised about something happening in your neighborhood and without your knowledge. And so the city of Calgary really puts that to the applicants to say, this is your responsibility. And we have a requirement that you let us know in writing what are the things that you're planning on doing and how that went. And that all forms part of our application review and ultimately decision.
One absolutely amazing thing you just said is customer service. And I'm not even sure I have ever heard that in relationship to government work. Usually when one interacts with the government, you feel like you're serving the government, not the other way around.
I do hear what you're saying. Yeah, this journey around efficiencies and process improvements has meant both looking at the community. And so how do we make sure that we are providing plain language notifications, and the signage that goes up on development sites is easy to understand and can be accessed in different languages, or has a QR code that takes them to our development map that shows way more details, and has the ability to get you into a portal with the city. But the other piece is that we've spent a tremendous amount of time in my department looking at customer service, and customers being the citizens, like I just said, but also the landowners, the developers, and the businesses. And by coming at it at that lens, it 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 enables us to to review the process together, instead of it being the City of Calgary, imposing. Our hope is that we can find a mutual outcome together. There are lots of times where we refuse applications. Do not misinterpret that. We are still in the practice of saying no to things that cannot, meet engineering standards, or are not appropriate in one use is not appropriate with some other uses. That is, of course, still foundational to the work that we do. But we also we recognize that housing was a priority. And so when I think about the file applications that we're talking about today, the priority was to ensure that we develop more housing and a variety of different housing types. And so that lens of saying, like, your outcome is this and our outcome is this, and let's find common ground and, know each other more than just as a transaction, I think has been really instrumental in achieving the targets that I said, which was leading the entire country in housing starts for 2 years in a row.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know if you're familiar with this book. I recently read this book called Recoding America by Jennifer Palka. And she talks about how to organize government in a way that it makes sense to a person. This is the language that she uses. And she talks more about digital systems when people are trying to fill out applications for Social Security online or interacting. But oftentimes these systems are not designed to make sense to a person. These systems are designed for some abstract rules that are very convoluted. And it sounds like you really spend a lot of time and effort making sure that a community member is the person this is designed for, right? Somebody that it would be easy to understand, the language is plain, that it's accessible and available.
Well,
and it sounds like it's working.
Well, it's a work in progress because it's never done, this work. But the piece that is foundational to this is that, and I say this openly, is we design the process under the legislation of our provincial government, which provides the context under which all planning has to happen through the Municipal Government Act. But the City of Calgary designs the process. And so if the process is not working, then we are the owners of the process and we are the owners of the redesign. If the process isn't working, we are the ones that can redesign it. And so we acknowledge that not all the processes work. And there are challenges oftentimes, especially by community members, in accessing information and then having the information at a level that is very plain language. Technical documents are always available, but if we can't actually access anything that is very plain language, then the engagement piece with what's happening in your community, I don't think is even possible. And so we have done, I would say it's at least a 6, maybe even 7-year journey to try and make our processes as easy to understand as possible. And then building on that, making them as visual as possible or accessible in different ways. So when we're doing policy work, especially, we've gone to a model where we can, use QR codes to access real-time translation services in areas that English may not be your first language. We've worked with the mediums. So for a long time, everyone thought, online surveys are going to save everyone and everyone's going to do them. And what we actually found is people are overburdened by the amount of emails. Like as a human, I can tell you, I also feel that. And in 2019, we went back to using both online and paper mailed copies of questionnaires when we're doing local area planning. So the policy work that goes behind all of the land use work that we're doing or the zoning work. And we found there was a huge spike in participation because the graphics, they can do it on their own time. They can do it in their own neighborhood or in their own living room. You don't have to feel like, oh, I didn't get the link. I don't want to use an online forum. I can, take my time and do this at my own pace. And so that like accessibility part, I think is foundational and in part of our zoning code is translated in that way so that people understand what's happening in their neighborhood. It's not always perfect, but we're really trying to help it.
Yeah. And what we can learn is from your experience, you're testing different ideas.
Absolutely.
You're iterating, right? I also thought that was really interesting that you described your process as a design process, which is it's not a kind of top-down legislative process, but much more iterative design process. I love that.
Well, it's not always in government's wheelhouse to openly acknowledge if something isn't perfect at the onset. And so there is risk that goes along with that piece. For zoning, we recognize that human preferences and how people live has evolved and changed over time. And our zoning codes are often locked in for 20 or 30 years before they're revised. It's kind of an interesting, if we really want to get into like the academia part of this, it's a very interesting complexity to city planning and city building when your city evolves every day, but your instruments that you use to govern your city don't evolve at the same pace. And how you, right size that is by trying to understand the people obviously in your cities and what they're doing and what they need, and then being able to have that conversation with your city councils to say, a really good example is around our downtown conversions. We were a city for many, many years, for the first 70 years of our city, where all business happened in our downtown core, where all, the largest majority of offices in our entire city were located in that area. And we were very resource dependent. So in Alberta, we have a very strong oil and gas sector, which had much of their head offices located in that central business district. And so in times when oil and gas would see recessions, our downtowns would clear out. And it was like a cycle after cycle that happened where we would have, vibrant, buzzing downtowns when oil prices were very high. And then when oil prices would go down, our downtown would clear out. And the City of Calgary said, like, we have to diversify our downtown so that we can weather these economic storms easier. In fact, everybody in the province really said that. The provincial government, had lots of policies to say, let's diversify, which is to the film and to the tech sectors. But when we did that, we recognized that our tools to actually enable that in the downtown, so our zoning and our building code, didn't align with being nimble to these cycles. And so what we did is we had created a downtown strategy which said we want to incentivize the conversion of a large portion of this office space that was empty at the time, 6 million square feet, into residential, so that the downtown had vibrancy and kept people in there regardless of what was happening in the cycle. And the city incentivized that through, we did a conversion program. So there was a grant program that we provided, which has been wildly successful. But we also used our regulating powers, and we said, if you're in this enterprise district where we want to target, you don't need to do development permits anymore. You can go right to a building permit, because we know that what you're going to be working on in a conversion is inside the building. It isn't really on the outside at all. It's only in the inside. So let's cut the permitting requirements so that incentivizes landlords to get this done. And it's been wildly successful. They've converted, I think it's close to 1.5 million square feet of office space into residential and other uses. There's a hotel, and then a major expansion to the University of Calgary came into our downtown core, and they used a full building to convert into a new university, part of the university campus. And then surrounding it, landlords said, wow, there's a university here. Let's convert our properties into housing, because we know that there's going to be students here all the time. And then what happened organically there? The street was busy. There were businesses that popped up because they knew that the students would be in this area. And it's been a model for how to incrementally revitalize your downtown.
As we are coming to kind of an end of our conversation, I'm wondering if you have any advice for towns that are just embarking on their sort of rethinking their zoning strategies. For example, we're here in Princeton, New Jersey, about to redo our entire land use ordinances. Any inspiration, any advice? What would you do if you had that opportunity?
Well, we are actually continuing to do our own here and writing a new zoning bylaw over the last couple of years. And one of the biggest pieces of advice that I have as someone that's been going through this is keeping your eye on simplification. So for the beginnings of zoning really came about because we wanted to keep things away from each other that would cause impact, like a landfill adjacent to a hospital, or a really heavy industrial area beside a residential area. And what happened from that kind of beginnings is we thought as creators of zoning throughout many years that we had to regulate everything. We had to just make sure that everything had a rule in every circumstance, in every type, shape, and form. And what I have found over the last number of years is that we still have the ability to govern and to make sure that those foundational pieces are being met so that we don't have land use conflicts. But we have to allow more flexibility in the work that we do in zoning, because the way that cities evolve, and you can see them around the world, is when zoning doesn't work, we find ways around it to make it work. And a really super good example of this is industrial areas, especially the kind of not the noxious kind, but the kind that offer excellent manufacturing, like indoor manufacturing, have evolved in our city to get a lot of kind of complementary community uses, like churches, like distilleries or breweries, like places where you would go to pick up specialty items. And breweries, churches, schools are another thing. So that we've seen a lot of schools trying to find alternative places to set up, because your communities are finished and they can't really like find a spot. But the evolution of education has come a long way since we originally planned communities. And without the flexibility in your zoning bylaw, you will never be able to achieve that vibrancy. When we allowed manufacturing of distilleries and breweries to pop up, we had a massive, and I mean massive, like 100 microbreweries popping up all around the city in areas that were just adjacent to communities, like where homes were. So people, instead of getting in their cars, got on their bikes and they would go, or they would walk or go to a couple of things. And then we realized that industrial areas don't allow restaurants, and people wanted to have a slice of pizza when they went. And so I'll enable that kind of flexibility with the eye on obviously safety and making sure that everything is foundationally okay. But having that type of flexibility should be foundational to the work that you do in zoning going forward, because cities will continue to evolve and they'll find a way. Like, people will find a way. And I think that it's those really special places in cities. Think about like Mexico City, like there's tiendas everywhere. There's small scale commercial. You don't see neighborhood stores anymore. There's like probably a podcast you should do on the death of the corner store, because that's a zoning result that happened when we didn't see the neighborhood store happen anymore, because it was very difficult to have a small store with residential on top to meet building codes and to do all of these things. And those are the very most special places, I would say, the hearts of our community. And so my advice to those that would be doing this is to look to have a principle of flexibility. And the more you say that out loud, the more people will talk about this. So it's not so rigid. It's not saying like housing goes here and way over here is where we'll see businesses. It's to say there's a flexible space that's between these two spaces that will enable those outcomes to happen.
Yeah. Yeah. And hopefully that's where the vibrancy and the specialness, that's where they live. Wonderful. Well, what a beautiful way to end this conversation. I can't thank you enough for your time, and hopefully you guys will continue to evolve and inspire us, and we'll try to catch up.
Thank you, Marina. This has been a lot of fun.